My grandmother was a first-generation Chinese immigrant to the United States. Grandma always said I looked like my mom when she was my age, no matter what age I was. I always looked like Mom, apparently. Grandma died last year. She did well enough for herself, but my mom did even better, especially as a single parent raising my brother and me. She bought this house, a one-story space with a basement, perfect for the four of us. Grandma always watched us while my mom was at work. Grandma almost exclusively spoke Chinese. I was a bit of a brat. Once I realized that everyone at school only spoke English, I had little interest in keeping up my Mandarin. As a result, Grandma and I didn't always talk much, but I still remember her stories. Yisian, the Magic Lotus Lantern, Sun Wukong, and the Journey to the West. That one was particularly close to Grandma. I wondered if she ever wanted to return to China, like the Monkey King. It was nice to be able to put Mandarin on a resume. Although, it may seem antithetical considering my degree is in English literature. I was the first in my family to graduate college at the ripe old age of 22. Upon graduating, I wanted nothing more than a break, so I moved back in with my mom and my brother. But now it seemed my break was going to be longer than I intended. There was less to do with an English degree than I anticipated. I was sending my resume and credentials left and right. I guess nobody wanted a little Asian Shakespearean even frying their chicken. One night, I considered putting Smith as my last name on my resume, just as a little experiment. I was in the basement, watching a movie while emailing job applications on my laptop. I sent in my last round of credentials and checked the time, 1:02 a.m. I closed my laptop, tossing it gently on the couch cushion next to me. I reached to grab my phone off the charger. Turning its face to me, I found it was dead. I had forgotten the charger downstairs was broken. No sweat, I thought. I'll just sleep in my room tonight and charge it there. I turned off the TV. It was pitch black. Of course, I had navigated this basement thousands of times. Like clockwork, I made my way around the couch, down the short hall, up the 4 stairs to the landing, then turned left to go up the stairs past the landing. It was claustrophobic on the stairs. A wall to the left and right, and a short ceiling above. The distance between the walls was only 2/3 of my wingspan. There was one wooden handrail on the right side. I placed my right hand along the smooth wood and my left hand in my pocket with my phone that bounced with each step. As my hand glided against the rail, I angled it just the right way so that it would slide smoothly off the end of the railing. But to my surprise, the railing didn't end. This gave me pause. I stopped and looked over at the rail. It was too dark to see anything. Standing in place, I kept sliding my hand up, but the end wasn't within my reach. I swear I was sober. I wasn't on anything. I hadn't even ingested anything since dinner. So I figured I was just more tired than I realized. I kept walking up the stairs. After maybe 5 steps, I had to pause again, scanning the rail with my palm, but still no end. I started to go up the stairs at a faster pace. I heard my heels hit the wood under the carpet. I must have climbed the length of at least 2 of my staircases before I stopped again, catching my breath. Kneeling down on the step ahead, I waved my hands wildly in front of me, searching for the door at the top of the staircase, or the little strip of hardwood floor that slid under that door past the top step. As I looked up, I couldn't even see the outline of light that would have come from upstairs. Where was the moonlight? I pulled out my phone from my pocket. I tried to turn it on. I knew it was dead, but I also knew that the low battery icon would flash if I hit the power button. Once it flashed, I waved the light in front of me, but it barely shined on 3 inches of space ahead. It was no use. I shoved it back into my pocket. I must have been hallucinating. Turning around, I started heading back downstairs, my left hand on the rail, one foot after the other, calmly bouncing downstairs. I knew I'd arrive at the landing eventually. At some point, I realized I must have descended more stairs than I had escalated. I paused, and my breathing started to slowly spiral. I tried to get a grip on myself, but it was at this point I moved beyond rational thought. I clutched the handrail, worried it would disappear if I let go. At the same time, I wondered, maybe if I let go of the handrail, then I'd find the end of the stairs. I had to force myself to unhand it, but I did, and I went back up the stairs, my hands clenched into fists in my pockets. Walking and walking and walking, I was confident that each step would be the one to finally take me to the door out of there. I had to stop and take a deep breath. I turned and started jogging the other way. My calves were lightly burning. I figured if I was hallucinating this, I must have looked like a real idiot, running up and down the same 10 steps over and over. Eventually, I had to stop going down. It felt like I was hyperventilating. My necklace must have been white in my pockets. A thought came to me. If I was close to the bottom of the stairs, then I could toss my phone in front of me. It would hit the wall at the landing. Surely the sound would wake me from this stupor. Taking my phone out of my pocket, my hand shook with nerves at my plan. I hit the power button so the low battery icon would flash again. Cocking my arm backward, I gave a swift toss. The screen was almost immediately enveloped in the darkness, and rather than hearing the phone bump into a wall, the sound rang rhythmically of the phone hitting step, then step, then step, then step, until that sound too evaporated into the darkness. It sounded like it was still falling by the time I couldn't hear it anymore. My eyes were wide open, yet I still couldn't see a thing. After standing frozen for what must have been a full minute, I sat on the step behind me and brought my knees to my chest. My mind ran rampant with what to do next. Sleep? There was no way I could with my heart beating this fast. Try to make a hole in the wall? If this was just a hallucination, Mom certainly would not be happy about that in the morning. Try falling down the stairs? Possibly. Before I was able to even keep thinking, I began hearing what sounded like whispers. Most of it I couldn't quite make out. I wondered if it was another language. I thought I made out some words. Trip. Fall. Weak. Useless. Suddenly, among the voices, I heard my name. May. I thought it was impossible for my heart to beat any faster, but I was wrong. I felt like it was about to beat up and out of my mouth. Some of the whispers sounded like laughs. Among the whispers came another voice, a very clear sentence in a language I understood too well. Why don't you try going up the stairs again? I stood up with a start and thought I heard something behind me. I turned quickly. For a moment, I thought I could see the figure of a man on a step above me. I nearly fell backward, but the outline disappeared almost as soon as I saw it. My mind must have been playing tricks on me in the dark. Despite being in the dark for what felt like minutes, my eyes simply would not adjust. It was still pure blackness. I reached out, and the railing was still there, but that provided minimal comfort. I used my other hand to swipe in front of me, just to be sure there truly wasn't anything there. The words of my grandmother came to my mind as I stood, petrified. She told us the story of Guida Qiang, the Guida Qiang, the name roughly translated to ghosts building walls. It's a phenomenon where all seems normal to a wanderer, but slowly the wanderer starts to circle back to where they started, and nothing can stop them from doing so repeatedly. It's as if a ghost is building walls to keep the wanderer in a single space. As a kid, I always wondered, why would the Guida Qiang do something like that to a poor wanderer? As I got older, the answer became clearer and clearer to me. When given the power, resources, and opportunity to torture someone, any creature will. I tried to remember everything Grandma had ever said about the Guida Qiang. Don't look over your shoulder. It was too late for that. I had turned around multiple times at this point. Look between your legs. The space is a window into the demon's world. I honestly considered this, but I was far too afraid of what I might see if I went through with it. What happened if I never got off these stairs? Would my mom and brother find my corpse here on these steps? Did I even still exist? Or had I vanished from my own dimension? Would I ever see my friends or family again? Hear them again? Touch them again? Ultimately, I decided I would slide down the stairs. I thought about falling down, but I figured I'd break a bone, if not die. I could get on my back and slide down as if it were a water slide. It would be uncomfortable, but eventually I would hit the landing, right? I assumed the position, crossing my arms as I lay down on the steps. I took a deep breath, ready to send myself down, but just as I was about to shove off, I heard something, lurching. It hit the left wall, then the right. Soon, I could hear it breathing. It was heavy, heavy breathing. Whatever it was much bigger than me. A bear? No, it must have been bigger. I could hear it coming up the steps. It was definitely walking on two legs, despite how heavy it sounded. As it took its steps, I heard something else. Clanking. The clanking of metal, like armor, or chains. I slowly sat up as the footsteps continued. At a rhythmic pace, the footsteps started getting faster. I slowly and clumsily scrambled to my feet, and I started sprinting up the stairs. I was running and running and running. I could feel my hair blowing behind me. The steps behind me kept getting faster in their own time. I didn't know how long I was running, but I was sweating and wheezing, and my muscles were on fire. Eventually, I started scrambling on all fours up the stairs like some kind of ape. I collapsed on the steps. I clutched the carpeted stairs between my fingers as I sobbed, not ready to face the hands and teeth of whatever was pursuing me. In an instant, past the sobs, I heard the words in a whisper. Inside out. And I remembered my grandmother's words. When trapped by a guida chiang, you turn your clothes inside out. As the breathing down the steps grew even heavier, I frantically dragged my shirt off my body, turned it inside out, and pulled it back on. Through my eyelids, black turned to red. The breathing on my face disappeared. My own breathing was normal again. The cheeks that were a moment ago tear-stained were now dry. My muscles felt relaxed. There was no trace of sweat on my forehead. I opened my eyes slowly. I saw the banister on the wall across from the one I leaned against. I looked up, and to my left. There, my brother stood at the open door atop the stairs, hand on the light switch, groggily asking, "Are you okay?" I foolishly looked back down where I saw my phone laying in the center of the landing, but I didn't go back for it. I ran up just 5 steps and hugged my little brother around his neck. He was surprised. "What time is it?" I begged to know. He showed me his watch, which read 1:03 a.m., just 1 minute after I'd left the couch. I scurried to my room. Though I was unsettled, I felt exhausted, and I managed to get to sleep quickly. The next morning, I turned on all the lights in the house and grabbed a little flashlight out of the hallway closet, just to be safe. I ran downstairs, snatched my phone and laptop, then ran back up. I didn't hang out in the basement so much after that. I sat at the kitchen table waiting for my bread in the toaster. I opened my laptop. There was a new email from an employer. Before I got the chance to open it, my brother came in and sat across from me, preparing some cereal. I suddenly became curious and asked him, "Why did you come to the basement door last night anyway?" Something woke me up. For a few minutes, I heard really loud stomping coming from the stairs. I drive part-time for Uber Eats. I'm a college student, so it's a great job to work around my school schedule. This happened on a night after my classes. It was probably around 11 p.m., and I didn't have class until late in the afternoon the next day. so I was planning on staying up late and grinding out as many orders as I could. At 1 a.m., I got a rare grocery order to pick up from a 7-Eleven and drop off at some address 15 minutes away. The directions took me through a few neighborhoods, going all the way to the back that led up to the woods before I stopped at the end of a gravel road. I looked at the address on the app, and it said it was down this road, but all I saw were a bunch of safety cones and construction things with no streetlights. I carefully went down, turning my brights on and navigating through until I reached the last turn. This was even more sketchy, though, being more of a path than a road. I looked more closely at the map again, and it was clearly telling me the address was down this way. I lifted my head and looked further down the path, and as my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I started to notice a structure at the end. It kind of resembled a house, but there was definitely something off about it. I then looked around and started to notice more houses. There wasn't enough light coming from my headlights for me to see them well, but based off what I could see, it looked like this was a community of new build houses and construction. Knowing this, I figured since the house on my GPS was one of the first on the path, maybe it was already complete. I turned and started heading down, pulling into an empty cul-de-sac with a single house on it. Up close now, it was definitely not complete. At least not fully complete. The front of it did look nearly done though, having a door and everything, which made this all really hard to figure out. At the end of the day though, all I had to do was deliver the stuff where I'm told, not to worry about someone else's housing situation. I parked and got out with the groceries, walking up to the front door and knocking. All the lights were off and it was completely quiet, enough to make me feel a bit uneasy. I sat down in the bags and turned around to get back to my car, but in the side of my view, I saw something move by the trees. I stopped for a moment, staring at the darkness in the woods. Whatever I saw wasn't moving anymore. I started walking quickly, getting in my car and turning it on. As soon as the headlights flashed, I saw a man standing right where I'd seen the movement in the woods. He was staring in my direction, watching intently as I started to back out. I felt my heartbeat rising as I looked at the man and wasn't paying attention to the road. I only rolled back 10 feet before I felt a huge bump on my back tires, followed again by my front. It was enough to make the entire car rock back and forth for a second, but my adrenaline was rushing too much for me to even get a good look at what it was that caused it. I pressed on the gas harder, getting off the path and onto the gravel road. Once I made it into the normal neighborhood, it was more obvious that my car was shaking and bumping, and there was no doubt that I had several flat tires. I was able to pull off somewhere where I felt more safe and then called the police. They searched the address and the Uber Eats account, but the address was an unfinished property that was not lived in and the account was a throwaway. They did find several large, sharpened metal objects on the path, though, likely placed after I'd pulled in as an attempt to get me to stop on the path. What they were attempting to do, once they had me stuck out there in the woods, is hard to say. Maybe rob me, or maybe something else, but at least I didn't have to find out. I live in a small but lively town in Massachusetts. Its local legends have fueled my love affair with the paranormal. It's a subject that fascinates me to this day. Coupled with insomnia, this passion led me to spend many a night at the nearby cemetery, hoping to see a ghostly apparition while walking through to pass the time. These outings were unfruitful, void of all activity, supernatural or otherwise. My dream of stealing a glimpse at what comes after eventually subsided, but I continued to visit the graves. It was a place where I could collect my thoughts when sleep eluded me. One night, however, something changed. It was a dark spring evening. I was bored, couldn't sleep, and felt the need to do something outdoors in the cool night air. As it so often did, the local graveyard called out to me. I obliged, unable to resist the allure of its calming nature. Sometimes, I was even tempted to set up camp there and sleep amongst the dead. Knowing this would be frowned upon and perhaps morbid, I settled for my walks. They were enough to make me at least somewhat weary by night's end. After a couple of hours there, I decided on one last stroll along the headstones in an attempt to become tired before heading home. Upon starting my walk, I noticed something. There was a light on in the groundskeeper's shack. It wasn't like him to be working so latey. This wasn't completely out of the ordinary until you factored in the large, gaping hole nearby, big enough for several caskets. It was a miracle I hadn't fallen into it earlier in the night. Curious as to what the old man was up to, I crept over to the shack, making my way to the busted window on its side. What I saw was strange. Inside were 9 men wearing tattered blue shrouds, partaking in a makeshift feast. The main course was an oily red stew with a horrific smell that permeated the shack's walls and ventured up my nasal passages, tempting me to gag. The men winced when putting it to their lips, save for 3, a tall man at the end of the table, and the 2 sat beside him. I listened closely. When the feast was over, it seemed the men in the shack stood up were part of a collective known as the Hello, newcomers. I hope dinner has been to your liking. The tall man spoke of was something akin to a medieval gladiator sport. It resonated throughout the shack and beckoned even me to listen. I listened on as Elijah divulged the game's inner workings. Elijah will explain the rules of your impending trial. 2 teams were to disperse to opposite sides of the cemetery, each consisting of 4 members, 3 blood runners and 1 blood baron. The initiates would be the runners, and the tall man's henchmen would act as barons. There was one more participant to be discussed, the tall man himself. He was the blood keeper. Though not on either team, he was the most crucial facet of the game. He kept and guarded what was referred to as the blood. I gathered that this referred to the red amulet hanging from the keeper's neck, as he firmly clasped it every time the word blood was uttered. The job of the runners was to retrieve the blood from the keeper. The barons acted as counsel, overseeing each team and helping where needed. After Elijah finished his lecture, the blood keeper took over. With every wound, there is blood. With every drop of blood, there is solace. Without death, there can be no light. The keeper opened a large cupboard in the corner of the shack, revealing a woman bound and gagged, futilely attempting to cry out for help. My heart sank. This was not your normal, run-of-the-mill cult ritual. I had to find help, but what if they heard me? Unable to nail down my next course of action, I was immobile, frozen in fear. The bloodkeeper continued. The light of blood can only be seen in death. Pulling a large red dagger out from his cloak, he grabbed the woman and plunged it into her gut. I watched in horror as the life left her eyes. She began to shriek, but was soon cut off by a cut to the chest, followed by a final blow to her neck. I was mortified. After throwing his kill to the floor, the keeper pulled out 3 vials, filling each of them with the blood that dripped from his blade. This was the blood the runners were after, not the amulet. This is all the blood I have to offer. That gives, at most, 3 of you the opportunity to become bloodlights. And remember, you are being watched. Those who fail to collect must be disposed of. The same goes for any outsider you encounter. Corpses are to be thrown in the pit. Dear God, I was truly in danger. That's what the nearby hole was for, the perfect hiding spot for a mass grave. You must stop at nothing to obtain one of these vials. All others will be sacrificed. Your thirst for blood must be as strong as your will to live. The men exited the shack to begin the trial. I scurried silently to the wooded part of the graveyard and hid behind a large tree, not wanting to end up like that poor woman. I just needed an opening to escape without being noticed. Glancing out at the cemetery, I saw a runner knelt before a grave, eyes closed. I assumed this was a requirement before the game commenced. A perfect chance for me to make a run for it. Let the trial begin. The Bloodkeeper's voice echoed through the trees before I could take even a single step towards safety. My survival still hung in the balance. Using a moonlit pool of water by my feet as a reflective surface, I watched as Elijah and 3 runners strategized just 10 yards from my position. My heart was pounding so hard, I was worried they would hear it. Between the beating in my chest and the conspiring whispers that filled the forest, my ears were consumed with an unsettling symphony of torture. Just when I couldn't bear another moment, silence cut through the brisk night air like the keeper's dagger piercing that woman's skin. A chill then burrowed into my spine. The Pudley's reflection bore no cloaked figures. Peering out from behind the tree confirmed that they were gone, or at least nowhere to be seen. This was my chance. Looking off into the distance, I saw a tomb by the main road, maybe 100 yards away. It would provide the perfect cover to escape towards civilization, but there was no way I could waltz over there without being seen. The woods wrapped around the cemetery, so running from tree to tree would strengthen my odds of survival. I took a deep breath and braced myself. Without so much as a second thought, I dashed to the next tree on the path to safety and took cover. I then gathered my wits and surveyed my surroundings. No cloaks in sight. I sprinted to the next tree and took another glimpse out at the world. The coast was still clear. As I was about to take off in the direction of my next hiding spot, panic set in as my feet inexplicably left solid ground. My blood ran cold as I was lifted into the air by some unseen force. The next thing I knew, my body was hoisted up and placed atop a tree branch. There, I was greeted by the unnerving sight of my captor, a blood runner. I didn't scream or try to get away. It would be no use. I sat there in terror and exhaled what I thought would be my last breath. Instead of gutting me, the man spoke. "What's your name?" I was too shocked to respond. "Come on now. Who are you?" He spoke clearer this time, revealing a slight English accent. "Look, I noticed you at the window over there, eavesdropping. If I wanted you dead, I could have killed you then. I want you to help me." "Help? You?" I asked. "Yes, I'm going to use you to my advantage. I take it you know what we're doing here, and you know the rules of the game." I nodded slowly, still shook. "Good. With you, I may be able to turn the tables and get the upper hand." I was frightened, but I calmed down enough to focus on the runner's plan. "See that tomb over there? That's where the Bloodkeeper is." My stomach turned. To think, this guy may have just saved my life. "I need you to go over to the tomb and open the door slowly. The Bloodkeeper will surely take a swing at you. Just as he's about to end your life, I'll swoop in and end his." "But why?" I asked. "That's not part of the game." "Right you are. You need not concern yourself with the why. Just know that if you don't do as I say, I will kill you myself. Now get going." The man gave me his cloak for protection and pushed me out of the tree. I didn't want to risk facing the Bloodkeeper, but I didn't want to perish at the runner's hands either. My fear of dying kept me from deviating. I again ran from tree to tree, eventually making it to my destination, the stench of bloodshed wafting through the air as runners fought for control of the field. With my back pressed to the cold, aged stone, the pull to escape grew. The main road was within reach, but the thought quickly subsided. I was far too worried the Englishman would catch up with me and take his price. He was able to climb a tree and lift my weight into it without a sound. It was clear he possessed the agility and stealth needed to take me by surprise during a haphazard run for the hills. I sighed in defeat, knowing that one way or another I would probably die that night. Mustering up every bit of courage I had left, I crept around the tomb and faced its door. My shaking hands reached for the rusted handle and pulled it towards me. Before its hinges could even creak at the motion, the door burst open, pushed from within. The force knocked me over, my head connecting with the unforgiving ground. The moments that came after remain fuzzy. The Bloodkeeper towered over me, half of his body in shadow, the other soaked in moonlight. A vision of death there to steal the blood from my racing heart. My eyes grew weary and shut for an instant before opening to see another figure. I couldn't make out who was who in my dazed state, but one attacked the other, completely overpowering them. The prey in this scuffle fell to his knees before landing face first into the cold, cemetery soil. The familiar sound of metal colliding with flesh rang through the air as the victor saw to it that the job was done. I prayed it was the Bloodkeeper being torn apart, otherwise I was a goner. My eyes shut again before unconsciousness finally took hold. "Hey, are you all right?" I heard an old man's voice as I came to. "Are you okay?" I opened my eyes to see who it was. The groundskeeper stood over me, holding a lantern to my face. "What? How? Where are they?" "Where's who?" he asked. "You don't understand. I should be dead." The groundskeeper stared at me, confused, but then smiled. "Come on, you'll catch cold out here." The groundskeeper, who I now know to be Pete, invited me into his shack. He prepared some food and tossed me a blanket to keep warm. Thankful and in need of an ear to fill, I told him everything, despite how I knew it would sound. I didn't describe the men by their given titles, but Pete seemed to know who I was talking about. "Sounds like you had a run-in with the Bloodkeeper." "That's him. How did you know?" "His spirit has been visiting these grounds for over 100 years now, I suppose." Mustering up every bit of courage I had left, I crept around the tomb and faced its door. My shaking hands reached for the rusted handle and pulled it towards me. Before its hinges could even creak at the motion, the door burst open, pushed from within. The force knocked me over, my head connecting with the unforgiving ground. The moments that came after remain fuzzy. The Bloodkeeper towered over me, half of his body in shadow, the other soaked in moonlight. A vision of death there to steal the blood from my racing heart. My eyes grew weary and shut for an instant before opening to see another figure. I couldn't make out who was who in my dazed state, but one attacked the other, completely overpowering them. The prey in this scuffle fell to his knees before landing face first into the cold, cemetery soil. The familiar sound of metal colliding with flesh rang through the air as the victor saw to it that the job was done. I prayed it was the Bloodkeeper being torn apart, otherwise I was a goner. My eyes shut again before unconsciousness finally took hold. "Hey, are you all right?" I heard an old man's voice as I came to. "Are you okay?" I opened my eyes to see who it was. The groundskeeper stood over me, holding a lantern to my face. "What? How? Where are they?" "Where's who?" he asked. "You don't understand. I should be dead." The groundskeeper stared at me, confused, but then smiled. "Come on, you'll catch cold out here." The groundskeeper, who I now know to be Pete, invited me into his shack. He prepared some food and tossed me a blanket to keep warm. Thankful and in need of an ear to fill, I told him everything, despite how I knew it would sound. I didn't describe the men by their given titles, but Pete seemed to know who I was talking about. "Sounds like you had a run-in with the Bloodkeeper." "That's him. How did you know?" "His spirit has been visiting these grounds for over 100 years now, I suppose." "His spirit?" Incredible. It was all a haunting, something I always thought I wanted to experience firsthand. Pete and I talked for a long while. He knew all about the Bloodlights and their dastardly deeds. Apparently they were a sadistic cult that formed in the 1800s, terrorizing the local community. Each Bloodlight initiation brought with it more disappearances. They used the cemetery as a space for their trails, burying casualties and sacrifices at the end of every night. After all, who would look for the bodies in a graveyard? Over 50 souls fell victim to the bloodlights before their sinister games were brought to a halt. During their last outing, an Englishman infiltrated their ranks and killed the Blood Keeper, avenging the death of his wife, who had been murdered during one of their trials. Soon after, his disciples came forward, claiming to have been controlled by the Keeper's amulet, alleging that it had supernatural powers. No such amulet was ever recovered. After Pete explained everything, I sat in awe, dumbstruck by the whole ordeal. Had I relived that fateful night? Or did I time travel and help that man fulfill his goal? I may never know what happened that day, but one thing is certain. I will never visit another cemetery for as long as I live, just in case the ghost of the Blood Keeper is still out there, making his rounds. Every year as a kid, my family would go on these big camping trips. I was always really excited because we lived in Arizona, where there's pretty much nothing, and we'd camp in Washington. Seeing trees and grass was my favorite part, but I also got to see all my cousins, and even though we only saw each other a couple times a year, we were really close. My favorite cousin, who was more like a brother to me, was Luis. He was a year older than me, and we were inseparable when together. Because of what happened, we became even closer after that camping trip. I think it took us both a while to understand what really went on and what more could have happened to us. It started when we had been there for 2 days already. Most of our family was either in the lake or by the campfire talking. Luis didn't like to swim, so we decided to play in the woods instead. We played a version of tag called Bandit. We'd switch off being the cop and chase the other one, who was the bandit, until we'd catch them. We would play for hours, but in the woods, it's easy to just keep running and not know where you're going. We tried our best to stay within viewing distance, but when Luis started chasing me with a huge stick, I guess my adrenaline kicked in the hyperspeed. I don't know how long I ran for, but eventually I ended up at an old-looking trailer. Luis wasn't far behind, but I remember him throwing the stick down, his focus now on what we both assumed was an abandoned trailer. We discussed investigating it further, and I'm not really sure why, but we decided not to. We started walking back, but we didn't really know where we were going. Probably about 10 minutes into our walk, we saw a couple coming towards us, pushing a shopping cart full of stuff. The woman approaches us and is really nice, while the man stayed back. She asked if we were lost, who we were with, our names and ages, and I remember when we told her how old we were. She looked back at the guy and then to us again. She told us we don't have to be scared, and she'll help us find our way home after they drop off their stuff at their campsite. She said we could also make s'mores if we wanted. Luis and I were hesitant, but she seemed really nice, and it was still daytime. So for some reason, that made everything way less suspicious. In my 7-year-old brain, bad people only do things at night, so we were fine. We walked with them for a while, following them back to their camp. While her and Luis were talking, I glanced over at the shopping cart. It was filled with a bunch of rusty metal things and what looked like to be nothing new. Nothing was in bags. Everything just looked like trash they'd found somewhere. I started to get really uncomfortable, and I could tell Luis was too. Every time I'd look over at the guy, he was never smiling, and sometimes he'd be staring at me with a blank stare. This was 18 years ago, and I still remember how creepy he looked. We walked a bit further until the trailer came back into view, and the woman grabbed Luis and mine's hands and asked if we were excited for s'mores. Suddenly, I heard Luis's name being called, and then mine. We all stopped for a second, and the lady squeezed my hand a bit tighter. She asked something to the guy along the lines of what they should do. He responded, but I don't remember what he said. The lady started to turn us toward the trailer while holding us tighter and tighter. She started to speed up as well into sort of a fast walk. I looked back and saw my sister through the trees. Without hesitation, I yelled her name, and the lady immediately let go of my hand. Luis and I ran to her as she made her way towards us. My sister yelled to the others that she'd found us. My mum and dad thanked the couple who had told them this elaborate story on how they've been trying to find our parents for a while now, and that we're such sweet boys and everything. I remember my parents inviting the couple over for burgers, but thankfully they declined. I think because the lady was so nice and that we were found safe, that my parents didn't think twice. I do recall my dad and uncle talking about how creepy the guy was, though. My cousin and I ended up telling my sister who found us that the couple was weird, but I don't think she understood what we meant. It wasn't until my cousin and I were old enough to understand that some people have really bad intentions. We talked about it again in depth, and we both came to the conclusion that, by the looks of it, they were tied on money and were probably going to sell us or something. For years growing up, I had kept this from my parents because I was supposed to be the strong man of the family, and thinking about that time made me feel gross and preyed upon. Luis also felt embarrassed, as he was older than me, and felt he had failed to protect me. We eventually told our parents a bye a few years ago. But I wish we had told them immediately, and maybe something could have been done. Nowadays, I never let my kids out of my sight, and always let them know that they can tell me anything without fear of being judged. Especially my son. This happened a while ago. I was driving home from a long day at work in the city. My house is in the suburbs, a decent distance outside of the city, so every day after getting out at 10, I have an hour of driving. A lot of the driving is through empty roads once I get out of the city, so it isn't that bad except for the amount of time it takes up. I was a little extra tired this night, which wasn't for any specific reason, but it was just one of those days. I was just half an hour out from my house and was driving along one of the more empty single-lane highways when through the dim streetlights, I saw something blocking the road. My eyes woke up, and I eased onto the brakes. As I got closer, the fog cleared enough for me to tell what it was. A tree laying over the entire road. I looked at it for a moment, just confused. There were no recent storms or high winds, and it wasn't here in the morning. I left the car on, but put it in park, then got out and looked around. There were no other fallen trees or signs of anything else being damaged. I walked closer and looked at both ends of the tree, but it was going all the way from both edges of the forest. No way through or around. This was such a bizarre situation. And it wasn't until now that the annoyance started to hit me. The closest alternate route was 15 minutes back and would take me the long way, adding a total of at least an hour to my already long drive. I thought about calling someone, but even then, it would probably take even longer to get it cleared. As I stood out in the road next to the tree, a light suddenly flashed on from the other side, shining through the branches and leaves. It wasn't from an approaching car, though. The car had to have already been sitting there, and for some reason, they only just now turned on their lights. As I tried looking through the branches to see what I could see, I heard a door open and close, and then footsteps approaching the other side of the tree. "Hello?" I called out, hoping to just ease the tension a bit. I heard someone mumble something, but not really in response to me. More of just to themselves. I thought maybe they too were frustrated about the blocked road, but then the branches started moving, and the leaves rustled as a man started climbing over. I took a few steps back, going closer to my car as they jumped onto my side of the road. From what I could see, it was a man with a short beard and a buzz cut wearing a thick jacket. He looked at me and started walking closer, still not having responded to me. I quickly got inside my car, unsure of what the man was doing, but I started to get a really bad feeling in my gut. He started walking faster, almost into a light jog as soon as I closed the door. The man came right up to the window and looked at me. No smile or friendly face, just a blank and empty expression as he knocked on the window. I asked nervously. The man didn't respond, but instead started mumbling to himself again as he looked me in the eyes and continued to knock on the window. I kept asking what he wanted, but he wouldn't stop knocking and started to get more aggressive, hitting the window with his fist. I quickly put the car in reverse and backed out, hearing a dull thud on the door, likely from the door latch being ripped from his hands. After hearing that, I knew that this was even more dangerous than I initially thought. It was late, about 3 a.m., as I was driving home from a work meet that ran late. This was a once-a-year meeting that took place 8 hours from the location I worked at. Driving through this state sucks because outside of the city it's mostly farmland, miles and miles long of just plain fields of crops. At least with the bare roads, I was able to space out and only have to focus on going straight. As I drove, though, it was out of nowhere that I saw a huge gap in the crops to the right of the road. When I passed it, I saw a car wedged pretty far into the crops as if they had driven off the road and weren't able to stop. It was not something I'd expected to see, but I couldn't see how running into a field of crops could really be harmful to them or have done anything significant enough for me to have to call for help. There was still service out here too, so they could definitely call for themselves. The car also wasn't on, which made me feel like they'd already been picked up or something. I continued driving, making it just a minute or two down the road before a set of headlights came up in front of me. After only a couple seconds, I was gaining on them extremely fast and had to swerve into the other lane to pass them. The speed limit was 80 on this highway, and that car had to be going no more than 25, which was insanely dangerous. Almost as soon as I passed them, though, they started speeding up, visibly getting closer and closer by the second until they were right behind me. I thought this was just one of those ego-obsessed losers that couldn't handle getting passed on the road, so I assumed he'd just speed past me and be on his way. But instead, he merged into the oncoming traffic lane and pulled his car right next to mine. I looked over and saw this man looking me in the eyes, but strangely, he didn't look angry. He had a slight smirk on his face, and that was about it. He looked to be in his mid-40s with longish hair and an unkempt beard. I moved my eyes away and back to the road, getting a little nervous. The car next to me then sped up and went right in front of me, slamming on their brakes, and before they suddenly turned their car to block both lanes and stopped right in the middle of the road. I was able to stop about 15 feet from them, too in shock to understand the severity of what was going on. The man didn't waste any time, getting out of his car right away and sprinting straight for me. There was no effort to hide his intentions, as he held a gun in one hand and now had a hood pulled over his head. I didn't have time to go in reverse, so I just pressed on the gas and swerved off the road, ramming into the crops on someone's farmland. For a moment, my car was continuing forward without letting me turn as it started slowing, even with the gas pedal pressed all the way down. In that instant, my heart sank and a wave of terror ran through me, thinking about the other car I'd seen that was stuck in the crops. But suddenly my wheels caught traction again, and I was able to swerve back out of the field and onto the other side of the road, hearing a single distant gunshot as I sped off. I called 911 and gave specific details on what happened, as well as telling them about the car I'd seen stuck in the field of crops. Whoever that man was out on the road that tried to stop me was never found. The police were able to locate the other car, but it was empty, no signs of the driver. It was just like they had suddenly swerved off the road and gotten stuck, then just disappeared. And who knows what happened afterward. Their situation was eerily similar to what would have happened to me. But if I had gotten stuck as well, then the other person in that car probably wouldn't have been the only one to have disappeared that night. I'm 29, and I live along the Appalachian Range in lower West Virginia. I've been going backpacking and camping for years, exploring different trails all around the nearby mountains. My best friend, who lives just a few miles from me, would often join me on these hikes. We usually planned one big trail every year in the fall, being anywhere from a few days to a whole week of backpacking and camping. In 2019, we planned to take a trail across the range to a small lake at the top of the mountains. In the days leading up to the trip, though, my friend had to call it off because of an emergency at his work. I'd already taken the whole week off of work and had everything ready to go, so I decided to just go alone. On Monday morning, I drove to a nearby trailhead, then started my route. This wasn't a regular recreational trail like you typically see on a 4-hour hike. These backpacking trails didn't have defined paths, so you have to use maps, compasses, and landmarks to navigate where you're going. Typically, there's a large landmark in the distance, like a specific rock formation that you hike toward, and when you get there, you could see your next landmark, and so on. I spent the first 2 days hiking toward a ridge in the mountains. When it got dark on the second day, I set up camp several hours from reaching the ridge. I pitched the tent and got a fire going, then heated up some of the food I brought in my bag. The sun had already set, and it was around 8 o'clock when I laid in my tent to rest and read. I left the fire going, planning to put it out before actually sleeping. 20 minutes into reading, and through the fire crackling outside, I heard the strong sound of a stick snapping right behind my tent. I jolted up. My first thought was a black bear, possibly having smelled the food I cooked earlier. I didn't hear anything else, though. I crawled out of the tent and shined a flashlight into the tree line behind my tent. Nothing. I called out aggressively to scare away any predators, but again, there were no sounds of anything running away. It was really strange because the stick snapping was very distinct, definitely being from something stepping on it. I stayed outside the tent for a while, looking around constantly before putting out the fire and going inside. I found it really hard to sleep that night because I was so focused on listening for more sounds. In the morning, I was almost surprised to have even slept through the night. I packed my tent and everything else at the campsite, then continued along until I reached the ridge. From there, it was a straight shot to the lake. I was moving fast, trying to get there before dark so I wouldn't have to move my campsite again the next day. I arrived with about an hour to spare before sunset. The lake was beautiful, very much worth the hike. I'm 29, and I live along the Appalachian Range in lower West Virginia. I've been going backpacking and camping for years, exploring different trails all around the nearby mountains. My best friend, who lives just a few miles from me, would often join me on these hikes. We usually planned one big trail every year in the fall, being anywhere from a few days to a whole week of backpacking and camping. In 2019, we planned to take a trail across the range to a small lake at the top of the mountains. In the days leading up to the trip, though, my friend had to call it off because of an emergency at his work. I'd already taken the whole week off of work and had everything ready to go, so I decided to just go alone. On Monday morning, I drove to a nearby trailhead, then started my route. This wasn't a regular recreational trail like you typically see on a 4-hour hike. These backpacking trails didn't have defined paths, so you have to use maps, compasses, and landmarks to navigate where you're going. Typically, there's a large landmark in the distance, like a specific rock formation that you hike toward, and when you get there, you could see your next landmark, and so on. I spent the first 2 days hiking toward a ridge in the mountains. When it got dark on the second day, I set up camp several hours from reaching the ridge. I pitched the tent and got a fire going, then heated up some of the food I brought in my bag. The sun had already set, and it was around 8 o'clock when I laid in my tent to rest and read. I left the fire going, planning to put it out before actually sleeping. 20 minutes into reading, and through the fire crackling outside, I heard the strong sound of a stick snapping right behind my tent. I jolted up. My first thought was a black bear, possibly having smelled the food I cooked earlier. I didn't hear anything else, though. I crawled out of the tent and shined a flashlight into the tree line behind my tent. Nothing. I called out aggressively to scare away any predators, but again, there were no sounds of anything running away. It was really strange because the stick snapping was very distinct, definitely being from something stepping on it. I stayed outside the tent for a while, looking around constantly before putting out the fire and going inside. I found it really hard to sleep that night because I was so focused on listening for more sounds. In the morning, I was almost surprised to have even slept through the night. I packed my tent and everything else at the campsite, then continued along until I reached the ridge. From there, it was a straight shot to the lake. I was moving fast, trying to get there before dark so I wouldn't have to move my campsite again the next day. I arrived with about an hour to spare before sunset. The lake was beautiful, very much worth the hike. I've always loved camping, especially in the fall when the leaves are changing colors and the air is crisp. So, when my best friend, who I'll call Katie, asked me to go camping with her for her birthday, I jumped at the chance. We packed up our gear and headed out to a secluded spot in the woods that Katie's family had been camping at for years. As we hiked in, I felt a sense of silence. In a good way, though, it was like we were the only two people in the world. The hike was relatively short, and when we arrived at the campsite, we both started working on setting everything up. This only took a portion of the hour, and after we finished, we decided to go for a hike. We went pretty much straight north, off the beaten path, just exploring, until we came across a faded trail, and said there was nothing out here, so she was confused. We followed the trail that wound through the woods and eventually led us to what looked like an old abandoned cabin. It was small and weather-beaten with broken windows and a sagging roof. Katie was eager to explore it, and I was a bit hesitant, but also really curious. We stepped inside. It was clear that no one had been there for years. We poked around for a while, looking for any interesting artifacts or clues about who had lived there, but we didn't find anything. As we were about to leave, I noticed something strange. There was a door in the corner of the cabin that I hadn't noticed before. It was very small and had a padlock on it. I pointed it out to Katie, and we both became curious. The lock looked really old, completely rusted all over. I knocked on the door, knowing nobody would be inside, but I just wanted to make sure. Katie went outside and grabbed a large rock, handing it to me. I smashed it against the lock, only taking a few good hits until it broke open. The door dragged against the ground as we pulled it back. Inside, it was pitch black, and we couldn't see anything. Katie pointed her flashlight through the doorway, and there was a staircase leading down. We both were creeped out now, but we assured ourselves that nobody has been here for years, and there really wasn't anything realistic to fear, and both of us rushed upstairs. We pushed the door shut again and stood there, unsure of what we just saw. We debated whether or not it was a crime scene of some sort, because it all just looked so out of place. As I was talking, Katie suddenly shushed me. In the distance, footsteps were coming toward the cabin. They came all the way up to it, but oddly, they walked right past it without stopping. I could see confusion on Katie's face, too. As soon as they were far away, we ran back to our campsite, then right back to Katie's place. We called the police just in case it was something. To us. The fact that the person kept walking without even stopping meant that they were familiar with the cabin. We didn't know if it was due to something bad or not, so we decided to let the police decide. They searched the cabin and the area around it, but ultimately found nothing leading to anything. They said it was really strange and even seemed like it had to be something bad, but there just wasn't anything justifying that. It ended up becoming a big thing in our town for a while, having the community talk about every possibility and theory of what the cabin was used for. The city even had the cabin torn down because they didn't want people visiting it. It still has never been figured out, and it probably never will, but there's just something in me that knows something awful happened there.